I started to ask myself an obvious question. If life has accelerated and we have become overwhelmed by information to the point that we are less and less able to focus on any of it, why has there been so little pushback? Why haven't we tried to slow things down to a pace where we can think clearly? I was able to find the first part of an answer to this question, and it's only the first part. When I went to interview Professor Earl Miller, he has won some of the top awards in neuroscience in the world, and he was working at the cutting edge of brain research when I went to see him in his office at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He told me bluntly that instead of acknowledging our limitations and trying to live within them, we have en masse fallen for an enormous delusion. There's one key fact, he said, that every human being needs to understand, and everything else he was going to explain flows from that. Your brain can only produce one or two thoughts in your conscious mind at once. That's it. We are very, very single minded. We have very limited cognitive capacity. This is because of the fundamental structure of the brain, and it's not going to change. But rather than acknowledge this, Earl told me, we invited a myth. The myth is that we can actually think about 3, 5, 10 things at the same time. To pretend this was the case, we took a term that was never meant to be applied to human beings at all. In the 1960s, computer scientists invented machines with more than one processor, so they really could do two things or more simultaneously. They called this machine power multitasking. Then we took the concept and applied it to ourselves. When I first learned about Earl's claim that our ability to think about several things at once is a delusion, I bristled. He couldn't be right, I thought, because I have done several things at the same time myself. In fact, I do it often. Here's the first example that came to mind. I have checked my email while thinking about the next draft of my book and planning out an interview I was going to do later that day. I did them all from the same toilet seat. I apologize for putting this image in your head. Where's the fantasy in that? Some scientists used to side with my initial gut instinct. They believed it was possible for people to do several complex tasks at once. So they started to get people into labs, and they told them to do lots of things at the same time, and they monitored how well it went. What the scientists discovered is that, in fact, when people think they're doing several things at once, they're actually, as all explained, juggling. They're switching back and forth. They don't notice the switching because their brain sort of papers it over to give a seamless experience of consciousness. But what they're actually doing is switching and reconfiguring their brain moment to moment, task to task. And that comes with a cost. There are three ways, he explained, in which this constant switching degrades your ability to focus. The first is called the switch cost effect. There is broad scientific evidence for this. Imagine you are doing your tax return and you receive a text and you look at it. It's only a glance taking 5 seconds, and then you go back to your tax return. In that moment, your brain has to reconfigure when it goes from one task to another. He said, you have to remember what you were doing before, and you have to remember what you thought about it. And that takes a little bit of time. When this happens, The evidence shows that your performance drops, you're slower, all as a result of the switching. So if you check your texts often while trying to work, you aren't only losing the little burst of time you spend looking at the text, you are also losing the time it takes to refocus afterward, which can be much longer. He said, if you are spending a lot of your time not really thinking, but wasting it on switching, that's just wasted brain processing time. This means that if your screen time shows you are using your phone 4 hours a day, you are losing much more time than that in lost focus. When Earl said this, I thought, yes, but it must be a small effect, a tiny drag on your attention. But when I went and read the relevant research, I learned there is some science suggesting the effects can be surprisingly large. For example, a small study commissioned by Hewlett Packard looked at the IQ of some of their workers in two situations. At first, they tested their IQ when they were not being distracted or interrupted. Then they tested their IQ when they were receiving emails and phone calls. The study found that technological distraction, just getting emails and calls, caused a drop in the worker's IQ by an average of 10 points. To give you a sense of how big that is in the short time, that's twice the knock to your IQ that you get when you smoke cannabis. So this suggests in terms of being able to get your work done, you'd better off getting stoned at your desk than checking your texts and Facebook messages a lot. From there, the research shows it gets worse. The second way switching harms your attention is what we might call the screw-up effect. When you switch between tasks, errors that wouldn't have happened otherwise start to creep in because, Earl explained, your brain is error prone. When you switch from task to task, your brain has to backtrack a little bit and pick up and figure out where it left off, and it can't do that perfectly. Glitches start to occur. Instead of spending critical time really doing deep thinking, your thinking is more superficial because you're spending a lot of time correcting errors and backtracking. Then there's a third cost to believing you can multitask, one that you will only notice in the medium or longer term, which we might call the creativity drain. You're likely to be significantly less creative. Why? Because where do new thoughts and innovation come from? Earl asked. They come from your brain shaping new connections out of what you've seen and heard and learned. Your mind, given free, undistracted time, will automatically think back over everything it absorbed, and it will start to draw links between them in new ways. This all takes place beneath the level of your conscious mind, but this process is how new ideas pop together, and suddenly two thoughts that you didn't think had a relationship suddenly have a relationship. A new idea is born. But if you spend a lot of this brain processing time switching and error correcting, Earl explained, you are simply giving your brain less opportunity to follow your associative links down to new places and really have truly original and creative thoughts. I later learned about a fourth consequence based on a smaller amount of evidence, which we might call the diminished memory effect. A team at UCLA got people to do 2 tasks at once and tracked them to see the effects. It turned out that afterwards they couldn't remember what they had done as well as people who did just one thing at a time. This seems to be because it takes mental space and energy to convert your experiences into memories. And if you are spending your energy instead on switching very fast, you'll remember and learn less. So if you spend your time switching a lot, then the evidence suggests you will be slower, you'll make more mistakes, you'll be less creative, and you'll remember less of what you do. I wanted to know, how often are most of us engaging in switching like this? Professor Gloria Mark at the Department of Informatics at the University of California, Irvine, who I interviewed, has discovered that the average American worker is distracted roughly once every 3 minutes. Several other studies have shown a large chunk of Americans are almost constantly being interrupted and switching between tasks. The average office worker now spends 40% of their work time wrongly believing they are multitasking, which means they are incurring all these costs for their attention and focus. In fact, uninterrupted time is becoming rare. One study found that most of us working in offices never get a whole hour uninterrupted in a normal day. I had to look again at the figure several times before I really absorbed it. Most office workers never get an hour to themselves without being interrupted. This is happening at every level of businesses. The average CEO of a Fortune 500 company, for example, gets just 28 uninterrupted minutes a day. Whenever this problem is talked about in the media, it's described as multitasking, but I think using this old computing term is a mistake. When I picture multitasking, I picture a 1990s single mother trying to feed a baby while also taking a work call and preventing the food she's cooking from catching fire. I watched a lot of vet sitcoms in the 1990s. I don't picture somebody taking a work call while also checking their text message. Now we use our phones too habitually that I don't think we consider doing a task and checking our phones at the same time as multitasking. Any more than we think scratching your butt during a work call is multitasking. But it is simply having your phone switched on and receiving texts every 10 minutes while you try to work is itself a form of switching. And these costs start to kick in for a year too. One study at the Carnegie Mellon University's Human Computer Interaction Lab took 136 students and got them to sit a test. Some of them had to have their phones switched off, and others had their phones on and received intermittent text messages. The students who received messages performed on average 20% worse. Other studies in similar scenarios have found even worse outcomes of 30%. It seems to me that almost all of us with a smartphone are losing that 20 to 30% almost all the time. That's a lot of brain power for a species to lose. If you want to understand how much harm this does, Earl told me, just look at one of the fastest rising causes of death in the world, distracted driving. The cognitive neuroscientist Dr. David Strayer at the University of Utah conducted detailed research where he got people to use driving simulators and tracked how safe their driving was when they were distracted by technology. Something as simple as their phone receiving text. It turned out their level of impairment was very similar to if they were drunk. It's worth dwelling on that. Persistent distractions have as bad an effect on your attention on the road as consuming so much alcohol that you got drunk. The distraction all around us isn't just annoying, it's deadly. Around 1 in 5 car accidents is now due to a distracted driver. The evidence is clear, Earl told me. There's no alternative. If you want to do things well, you to focusing carefully on one thing at a time. As I learned all this, I realized that my desire to absorb a tsunami of information without losing my ability to focus was like my desire to eat at McDonald's every day and stay trim. An impossible dream. The size and capacity of the human brain hasn't significantly changed in 40,000 years, Earl explained, and it isn't going to upgrade anytime soon. Yet we are deluded about this fact. Dr. Radiel Rawson, a professor of psychology at California State University, discovered that the average teen and young adult genuinely believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at once. We are not machines. We cannot live by the logic of machines. We are humans, and we work differently. When I learned all this, I realized another crucial reason why I had felt so good and so mentally restored in Provincetown. For the first time in a long time, I was allowing myself to focus on one thing at a time for long stretches. It felt like I had had an enormous boost in my mental capacity because I was respecting my mind's limitations. I asked Earl if, given what we know about the brain, it was fair to conclude that attention problems today really are worse than at some points in the past. He replied, "Absolutely, we have." He believes created in our culture a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of distraction. This was hard to take on board. It's one thing to have a hunch that there's a crisis. It's another thing to hear one of the leading neuroscientists in the world tell you we are living in a perfect storm that's degrading your capacity to think. The best we can do now, Earl had told me, is trying to get rid of the distractions as much as possible. At one point in our conversation, he sounded quite optimistic, suggesting that we can all achieve progress on this starting today. He said, "The brain is like a muscle. The more you use certain things, the stronger the connections getting, and the better things work. If you are struggling to focus," he said, "just try monotasking for 10 minutes and then allow yourself to be distracted for a minute. Then monotask for another 10 minutes and so on. As you do it, it becomes more familiar. Your brain gets better and better at it because you're strengthening the neural connections involved in that behavior. And pretty soon you can do it for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, just do it. Practice at it. Start slow, but practice, but you will get better there." To achieve this, he says, you have to separate yourself for increasing periods of time from the sources of your distraction. It's a mistake, he said, to try to monotask by force of will because it's too hard to resist that informational tap on the shoulder. When I asked him about how, as a society, we could find a way to do this, he told me that he is not a sociologist and I'd have to look elsewhere for answers to that.